In this video we will see about the cohort study design. Cohort study design is a group of persons selected for some common characteristics. Cohort is a group of persons selected for some common characteristics and who will be followed over a period of time to find out the rate at which they develop disease or die from the disease. So when we say cohort means a collection of people who have common characteristics. So in case of cohort study design, groups who have common characteristics are selected at the beginning of study and will be followed over a period of time in the future and observed whether they are developing a disease or not. So cohort study is an observational study that measures incidence of occurrence or incidence of disease. So because it studies incidence of disease, because it is followed for the future. So this is population at risk. So population at risk, that means they are not develop the outcome of interest. So this population at risk will be categorized as exposed and not exposed. So population at risk will be selected for some individuals, will be in groups will be selected, those who are exposed, and groups are selected those who are not exposed. So exposed groups are diseased and not diseased, exposed diseased and not diseased, not exposed are diseased for not. That means at the beginning exposed individuals will be selected and will be followed and will be observed whether they are developed disease or not disease. And also individuals without exposure are selected and will be followed in the future and will be observed whether they are developing a disease or not. So in the case control, case and controls are selected and will be go back and observed for exposed, non-exposed, and cases for exposed, non-exposed, controls for exposed, non-exposed. But in the case of cohort, exposed individuals are compared for disease, not diseased, and not exposed individuals are compared for disease and not disease. So time and direction of inquiry are in the future. So the study are present at this time and will be followed in the future. So this is known as cohort study design. So design of cohort studies. If you want to know whether the exposure to drinking coffee during pregnancy will result in abnormal birth, for instance, you want to drinking coffee as exposure and as outcome is abnormal birth. So if you want to this, there is population at risk here and people without the outcome of pregnant mother. So this is population at risk, maybe population at risk, that means there is no outcome, meaning outcome maybe a pregnancy or abnormal birth. And you will select from this population at risk, you will select exposed and non-exposed individuals. So exposed individuals are drinking more than 5 cups of coffee per day. So those who drinking coffee more than 5 times are exposed. Not drink any coffee is not exposed. So these individuals will be selected based on drinking coffee. So exposed individuals will be compared for diseased and not diseased. So how many of exposed individuals will give abnormal baby, will birth abnormal baby? How many of exposed individuals will give normal baby? That means not diseased. So and also among those who are not drinking coffee, individuals are compared for diseased and not diseased. Diseased give abnormal baby, not diseased give normal baby. So how many of individuals who is not exposed are give abnormal baby, and how many of who are not exposed are give normal BP. So these outcomes are compared. So this is an important concept for cohort study. So cohort study having similar terms. Instead of cohort study, you can say follow-up study, you can say incidence study, you can say longitudinal study, and we can say prospective study. We can say this is similar terms. So studies a group of exposed and unexposed subjects and follow the population over the period of time and compares incidence of developing disease of interest into two ground. So whether they are developed or not the disease, but studies a group of exposed and unexposed subjects. So types of cohort study. There are two types of cohort study. This is classification based on the temporal relationship between the initiation of the study and the occurrence of disease. So there are two types of cohort study: prospective cohort study and retrospective cohort study. So this is an important diagram to show the difference between prospective cohort study and retrospective cohort study. So prospective cohort study it will be in the future. So this is classical, the most common type of cohort study. So at the beginning we will measure the exposure here, or we will select exposed and unexposed individuals, and they will be followed, and we will see whether they develop the outcome or not. So this is known as prospective study design. In retrospective study design, or we can say sometimes historical study design. So we are here, this is the present time of study, so already the outcome is occurred here, but conceptually or in time we will go back and we will start here and we will record exposure, means maybe in the cards or in some registries we will record exposure. That means we will group exposure and non-exposure individuals, and we will collect data there, and we will follow in the future and measure whether these individuals are develop the outcome or not. But the present time of since we are starting the beginning of the study, the outcome and the exposure already occurred. So this is the beginning of study. So theoretically or conceptually we will go, or in time we will go back and we will assess in the future. So this is known as retrospective cohort study. But in the case of prospective, the beginning of the time is here, and we will go follow in the future. But in the retrospective study we are here, but we will go back and follow in the future until the present time. So this is the difference between prospective cohort study and retrospective cohort study. So this is keeping in mind. Prospective cohort, disease-free individuals are selected first. Their exposure status is ascertained. So first, individuals who are free from disease are selected. Then we will assign the exposure status, ascertain the exposure status. Who is the exposure status? Whether drinking coffee, like that. So the exposure is drinking coffee, for instance. Subjects are followed for the period of time to record and compare the incidence of disease between exposed and non-exposed individuals. This means if our exposure is drinking coffee, so pregnant individuals will be followed for 9 months, and at birth we will compare whether that women with baby are develop congenital anomaly or not, develop birth defect or not, is our outcome. So this is the good example of prospective cohort. So the measure of association is risk ratio or rate ratio. Risk ratio is in the case of cumulative incidence, rate ratio is in case of incidence density. So at the beginning of the study the outcome has not yet occurred, so outcome is not occurred in the case of prospective study. Unless specified, cohort study refers to the prospective type of cohort. Most when you are observing most studies or articles published, most times they said cohort study design. So unless it's not specified, if it is a written cohort study design only, that is prospective cohort study design. If not prospective, it will be written retrospective cohort study. So mostly retrospective cohort study will be written. If retrospective is not written, if it is only cohort is mentioned, so the cohort is prospective cohort. The cohort is prospective cohort. So basic elements in cohort study design or prospective cohort study design. So in this PowerPoint also, if you are saying cohort, that is prospective cohort. So in the first, individuals are disease free at the entry. First, the individuals or our study participants are, if it is disease free at the entry, or outcome free for outcome of interest as the beginning of the study. So selected by exposure status rather than outcome. For instance, birth defect is outcome, exposure status is whether they are drinking coffee or not. So they will be selected whether they are drinking coffee or not, but not whether they have newborns with congenital anomaly or not. So they will selected by exposure status. Follow-up is needed to determine the incidence of outcome. So individuals with exposures or drinking coffee or not coffee will be followed for 9 months to determine the incidence of the study. So if there is no follow-up, we cannot say incidence. So compares incidence rate of exposed against unexposed group. So incidence rate of exposed against unexposed will be compared. So in exposed and unexposed individuals, exposed individuals will be compared for this outcome or this outcome. So this is very important concepts. They should be free of our outcome of interest. Selected by exposure status, there must be follow-up time, and exposed and unexposed group should be compared for their disease status. And there is exposure status. Study subjects should be disease free. Define the study subjects using inclusion and exclusion criteria. Possible outcome in cohort. First, exposed and unexposed individuals will be followed for the future, and the outcome may be not disease. The outcome may be diseased individual. The outcome may be lost follow-up individuals. The outcome will contain died individuals. So we will get no disease, lost follow-up, death. The outcome of interest. So if our interest is disease or not disease, this is the main outcome. So others will be maybe censored if it is incident, if it is our rate of calculation is incidence density or survival analysis. So the other is features or characteristics of the cohort study. Cohort study, an important characteristic of cohort study, it shows temporal sequence. That means there is exposures or risk factors, then risk factors will show the disease outcome. So because of the follow-up, so it shows temporal sequence or temporal characteristics. So it is good to assess rare exposure. Rare exposure is assessed in cohort study. Rare exposure is not suitable for case control study but suitable for cohort study. Could assess multiple effects for single exposure, for simple exposure. So from single exposure we will find multiple outcomes or multiple effects or outcomes, but in case of case control study, for single disease we will get multiple exposures, multiple risk factors. But in the case of cohort, for single exposure we will find multiple effects or outcomes. So the strength of cohort study is a particular value when exposure is rare, rare exposure. It can examine multiple outcomes or effects for single exposure, can elucidate temporal relationship between exposure and disease, allow direct measure of incidence of disease in exposed and non-exposed individuals. Limitation of cohort study: it is inefficient for evaluation of rare disease. But evaluation of rare disease is efficient for case control study, but inefficient for cohort study. Can be expensive and time consuming. By the way, it's expensive and time consuming since it has follow-up time, it needs large number of participants or sample size, and since it's since it have follow-up time, it is very expensive and time consuming. Requires the availability of adequate records, validity of results, seriously affected by lost follow-up. If there is lost follow-up, validity will be threatened. So this is a limitation. Selection of the exposed population. Exposed population should relate to the hypothesis. For example, for common exposure, smoking, coffee, or drinking. So exposure, smoking, smoker, non-smoker, coffee drinker or not, and alcohol drinking or not is exposure. So relatively common chronic disease, the general population, geographical difference in the areas are good choice. So mostly exposed population will be selected from general population in the community. So this is good. And selection of comparison group. The groups being compared should be as similar as possible on all factors that relate to disease other than the exposure under investigation. So groups being compared should be similar as possible on all factors related to the disease other than exposure under investigation to reduce the potential confounding. Yes. So for instance, it is better to, for instance, if exposed individuals are selected from the general population, controls are selected from the general population. So all characteristics will be similar and related to the disease except exposure under the investigation. For instance, if you want to our studies smoker, non-smoker exposures, but outcomes are lung cancer or not. So for lung cancer or not, individuals will be selected, exposed individuals will be selected, non-exposed individuals will be selected. Except smoking, all other characteristics should be similar. So except for exposure under investigation or exposure of interest, all factors that relate to the disease should be similar between the two groups or exposed and non-exposed groups in order to reduce potential confounding. So exposure, source of exposure information. So exposures may be selected from pre-existing records. Exposures may be recorded from self-report, interviews, or surveys. So this is common. The self-report or direct measurement is mostly common for cohort. So direct measurement, BP, serum sample, environmental measurement. So exposures, individuals who is exposed, non-exposed are measured by direct measurement or self-report, by asking or by interviewing respondents or participants. Maybe pre-existing records or charts will be, or death certificates, clinical history, medical examination, hospital discharge logs, all are the source for exposure information. So the second type of cohort study design is retrospective study design or retrospective cohort study design. In this case, an investigator has access to exposure data on a group of people. So study sample is divided into exposed and non-exposed groups. So both the exposures and outcomes of interest have already occurred at the beginning of the study. Hence, it is retrospective or historical study design. By the way, one of the difference between the retrospective and the prospective course study design, prospective is followed for the future, retrospective is followed also for the future, but retrospectively. That means since it has follow up, the exposure and the outcome of interest is already happened. But in the case of prospective, the exposure is found at the beginning but followed for the future. This is the difference between prospective and retrospective study design. So all other methods are similar for retrospective and cohort study design. The difference is time dimension. So studies only period outcomes and not future ones. So future ones is for prospective, period outcomes is for retrospective. The disease experience of exposed and non-exposed groups is compared risk ratio or rate ratio. All are similar. All characteristics for prospective and retrospective course design is similar, except this difference, and for other additional some differences they are similar. How to perform is similar. So strengths of retrospective study design can study the effect of exposures that no longer occur. So the effect of exposures that no longer occur, discontinued medical treatments. So quicker and less costly than prospective course study, since it is exposure information should be collected from records. It should be less costly and simple or quicker, particularly efficient for study of rare exposure, efficient for studying diseases with long latency period. Yeah, this is very important. When we say long latency period, for instance, if one disease latency period is or for instance whether the disease developed or not developed is your outcome of interest, but when the latency is long, occurrence will be long. So if it take for instance 10 or 20 years, individuals follow in the population for 20 years, very costly and difficult. But in chart or record, we will get 10 years follow up. We will get that disease duration or disease and incidence, which is written in the chart or records. So it is very important for the long diseases which have long latency periods. So it will minimize the duration. Can examine multiple effects for single exposure. Can yield information on multiple exposures. May allow direct measurement of incidence of disease like prospective cohort. So this is very important. The limitation is not useful for study emerging or new exposures. Reliance on existing records. Yeah, availability of data, subject record. For instance, availability of data means, for instance, if the exposure is maybe depend on the chart, those variables, important variables, which is not recorded in the chart, will be missed, and so some charts will be incomplete. So this will affect the outcome. So reliance on existing records may be less accurate and complete than data collected prospectively. So maybe since the information is filled by other than investigator, this is information may be not accurate, maybe not complete. So records were not recorded for the hypothesis of interest. Yeah, so this will affect. But in the prospective study design, since the data is collected for this study, all things should be carefully recorded and under supervision. Information on potential confounding factors are often unavailable from existing records. Yes, so since the record is filled by for medical purpose, you will lose some confounding factors which is not recorded in the chart. So this is also another limitation. So the other type of concept is follow-up study design. follow-up study design is mostly follow-up study design. We do have two types of follow-up study design: prospective follow-up study design and retrospective follow-up study design. Mostly, as we have mentioned earlier, follow-up study is similar to cohort study, but mostly we are applying and individuals or studies which is non-exposed individuals absent. So for instance, there is population at risk here. Population is at risk is so exposed individuals and non-exposed so here this is population at risk. The population at risk is in case of this study, non-exposed individuals is may not be selected or may not be applied or practical in case of ethical issues. The population at risk, exposed individuals only will be selected and followed for the future, and will be compared outcome and the development of outcome and the non-development of outcome will be compared. So in case of absence non-exposed individuals, the name or the contextual will be used follow-up study design. So for instance, if you follow neonates with septic neonates and non-septic neonates, so for treatment, so ethically is not recommended for septic neonates with medication and non-septic neonates, septic neonates with medication and septic neonates without medication. So since ethically is not good, septic neonates followed without medication, so these groups are avoided. So only follow septic neonates. So self-compared or self-control will be used. For instance, if you age compare with sex with outcome, so sex male and female will be compared other than septic with medication and non-septic without medication. So in case of this, one arm is absent, we will use follow-up study design. That means prospective follow-up study design or retrospective follow-up design. So this is an important concept. The other is advantages and limitation of cohort and case control study. Since we have seen in the cohort study advantage disadvantage, it's important to add these concepts. Case control study advantage: optimal for evaluation of rare disease, can examine multiple factors for a single disease, quick and inexpensive, relatively simple to carry out, but inefficient to evaluation of rare exposure, cannot directly compute risk, difficult to establish temporal relationship, determine exposure will often rely on memory or recall bias may present. In case of cohort study is advantage on cohort study is important for value. It is valuable when exposure is rare. Can examine multiple effects for single exposure. Temporal relationship is known. So allow direct measurement of risk. Minimize bias in ascertainment of exposure. So but inefficient for evaluation of rare disease. It is expensive and difficult, time consuming. Loss to follow up creates problem. If it is more than 25% is lots of problem. If loss to follow up is more than 25% is as create a problem. So this is all about advantage and disadvantage of cohort and case control study. A measure of association in cohort study design is relative risk. So incidence exposed over incidence not exposed. So relative risk is a measure of association. Presence of association: if relative risk is the outcome of or the finding of relative risk is 1, we say there is no association. For instance, if you want to compare coffee drinking for congenital anomaly, so if the outcome is 1, there is no relationship between drinking coffee and congenital anomaly. If relative risk less than 1, negative association. That means drinking coffee does not lead to congenital anomaly, or it's protective. The other is relative risk greater than 1, we can say positive association. That means when we are drinking coffee, the more we will develop congenital anomaly. So congenital anomaly or birth defect and drinking coffee greater than more than 5 times have positive association, or drinking coffee is a risk factor for the development of congenital anomaly if it relative risk greater than 1. So sample p-value less than 0.05, it is statistically significant association. That means relative risk is different from 1. That means if it's 1, there is no association. Different from 1, statistically significant association, either negatively or positively. So statistical methods, mostly survival methods or survival analysis. So we will use survival analysis. So strength of association, weak if close to relative risk is close to 0, strong relative risk is far from 0. So relative risk is greater than 5 or something like that, it will be strong. Greater than 3, it will be. So when relative risk is zero, it will be relative risk is close to 0 or 1. It we will see it's weak. We will see a weak association. If it is close to 1, we will say weak association. So the other is incidence and determinants of adverse outcomes among women who were managed for eclampsia. So this is retrospective follow-up study design. So retrospective follow-up design. So incidence means the adverse outcome. So the incidence of adverse maternal outcomes in eclamptic mother was 53.7. That means this study makes that it is retrospectively done, but the follow-up is made on charts. That means on charts first in the mothers with eclampsia and mothers without mothers with eclampsia is identified. So mothers with eclampsia followed for outcome, that means adverse maternal outcomes. So whether mothers with eclamptic mothers, whether they develop adverse outcome or not, is our outcome of interest. So since there is no mothers without eclampsia, we use the term follow-up study design in contrast to cohort study design. So retrospective follow-up design is was since another arm, that means non-eclamptic mother, is absent. So the other is effects of gestational diabetes mellitus. This is a prospective cohort study was conducted among pregnant women followed from pregnancy to delivery. This is it is prospective cohort study. So in this study effects mother with gestational diabetes and without gestative followed for maternal outcome. So women with gestational diabetes had a high risk of composite adverse maternal outcome. So adjusted relative risk. So relative risk they are used relative risk. So individual mothers with gestational diabetes, mothers without gestational diabetes followed, and their outcomes are compared. So their measure of association is relative risk. This is example for prospective cohort. This is comes for retrospective cohort or retrospective follow-up study design. So this is all about the cohort study design. Next time or next video we will have about interventional studies. Don't forget to subscribe this channel to get the next videos. Have a nice time. Bye bye.